For 5 seasons in the 70s and 80s, Charlie's Angels followed the adventures of a group of female detectives who had been recruited into the Charles Townsend Agency. In 115 episodes, viewers never saw Charlie's face. Pretty unusual to have the person whose name is in the title of the show not ever appear on screen. Even so, Charlie's Angels carried out their missions every week, or so I am told. I don't know if any of you are Charlie's Angels fans. I cannot list myself among that group. There is a remarkable story about a remarkable person in Luke 7. We just had his story read to us. The heading of your Bible, if you have a Bible app or a regular old analog Bible made out of wood, the heading of your Bible probably says something like a centurion's faith. That's what the story is about. And yet, the centurion never appears on the page. All the action, all the messages come through people he sent on his behalf. And even though we never see his face, even though he never walks onto the stage personally, at the end of the story, we're told that Jesus was absolutely astounded at this man's faith. Now, sometimes our culture uses the word faith to talk about spirituality in a sort of non-specific, benign way. For example, if an interviewer doesn't want a confrontation with the person they're interviewing or with their audience, they will, and that person is a person who believes in a religion or is a Christian, they'll talk about faith instead of actually saying the word Christian or the word Hindu or the word Muslim. It can be a sort of group everybody together kind of word, that thing that some of you have, faith, right? Our secular culture is generally fine with you as a Christian having faith in some generic far-off sense, something that you do when you're on your own time, but keep it to yourself, right? Don't bring it to work with you. But for a Christian, if you're a Christian here this morning, faith is the most crucial aspect of who you are, what you think, and what you do. It is meant to not only define who we are, but motivate all of the things that we think and do. It's meant to be the calibration by which we look at the world, look at our circumstances, make decisions, have attitudes. Here are just a few of the things that the Bible tells us about our Christian faith: that we've been justified by faith, that we are saved by grace through faith, that we cannot please God. No, it's impossible without faith, that we walk by faith, that's every day, that we live by faith, that's everything. Faith should absolutely define a Christian's whole life. And so in this text, we get to examine a person's faith, a wonderful dramatic story about living faith. This centurion's faith, we'll see, changed his understanding, shaped his attitudes, motivated his actions. It made him who he was. And his faith made life-changing differences for the people around him. So this is a great example for us as people who want to be full of faith, growing in faith, walking by faith, living by faith. Let's take a look. Verse 1. When Jesus had concluded saying all this to the people who were listening, he entered Capernaum. So in Luke chapter 6, as it closes, Jesus has just completed what we sometimes call the Sermon on the Plain. It's the Sermon on the Mount, but in Luke, we're told that the Lord gave it after coming down from a hilltop and standing in a level place. It's not a contradiction that one guy says he did it on a mount and one guy says he did it on a plain. It's that Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount multiple times in different places. After this particular delivery, he and his disciples and a large crowd of people who had been listening to that sermon, they walked into Capernaum and are immediately confronted with the situation that we're reading about this morning. Now, the Sermon on the Mount is maybe the most important teaching in all of Jesus' ministry, maybe all of church history, maybe the most important speech ever given in all of all time, right? And in the Sermon on the Mount, we are confronted with what faith really means, what faith really does in the life of a Christian. How it's not just about certain things that we know or certain things that we intellectually say we agree with, but how it completely reshapes your living experience, your expectation for life, your plans for life. We learn about how Christians, the Christian faith, gives us joy in suffering, how we are to totally redefine what is important in this life based off of what God says is important. Things like how we are to love our enemies and show them mercy because God, our Father, is merciful. And because he has been merciful to us, now we are conformed to his image and are merciful to others. So Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount to this large crowd of people who were listening, and on some level said, I agree with that, let's follow after this guy. And then after preaching this message, Jesus has a chance to essentially practice what he preached. More importantly, just to demonstrate what he preached. There's no question whether Jesus practiced what he preached in the sense that we talk about it. Does that person practice what they preach? Of course, Jesus had total integrity, total consistency with what he preached and what he did. But more importantly, to this large group of people who said, we want to follow you, Jesus. We want to believe in you, Jesus. We want to live in faith with you, Jesus. Now they have a situation where they've been told, you need to love your enemies, you need to show mercy to those who are different than you need to redefine what is important in life. And now, through the wonderful act of providence, these people are able to see it now lived out through the example of Jesus, who's going to demonstrate how these things are true. How God really does have power to work this way through your life. How it's not just words, but it is deeds. To show those who had been listening the reality of God's commands and how we live out God's commands faithfully. Verse 2, a centurion's servant who was highly valued by him was sick and about to die. So most of you know centurions, they were commanders of either 80 or 100 people in the Roman army. They were serious warriors. One resource calls them this, prestigious members of a relatively small class of military leaders. There were different ranks even of centurions. Some ranked like what we might call a knight in an empire. And so they were a big deal, a lot of influence, a lot of experience, a lot of power. This particular centurion had a servant who was very sick. Now, Matthew's gospel also tells this story, and in his telling, he uses a term that indicates the servant was just a boy, a young man. And he tells us that this young man was paralyzed and in terrible agony. In fact, the word Matthew uses is one that means being tortured. And so this is a very bad situation for the servant boy, but also we see for the whole household, because this servant was highly valued by the centurion. And we need to understand that this whole situation, we're going to see glimpses into the heart of the centurion. And we'll see that his faith has changed the way that he lives, and it has made him into the person that he is. And so we look into these glimpses into his heart. And so when we're told here that he was highly valued by the centurion, we need to understand this doesn't mean he was valuable as property. The centurion didn't look at the servant boy and say, well, that's my very best DeWalt drill over there. Don't let the other people use that one because I need that one to stay nice, right? No, he wasn't valuable as property. He was valuable as a person. This was a genuine care. The servant boy was precious to the centurion. Now, this is unusual. It's unusual in the Roman Empire. It's unusual in the culture of the time for a master like this to have a care like that. They just didn't. If you want to read or learn a little bit more about masters and servants and things like that, look at the epistle to the Ephesians, where Paul has to talk to Christians about, hey, this is how you should treat your servants and things like that. So this is an unusual situation. This wasn't just some stone cold killer. But this centurion was a man with a heart beating in his chest. How is that possible? It's not what we would expect from a Roman centurion. But it's because this man has been transformed from the inside out by his faith in a particular person. We'll see that it's Jesus Christ. And his life throughout this story is bearing fruit from that faith. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Verse 3, when the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to him, requesting him to come and save the life of his servant. So the question is, what did the centurion hear about Jesus? We're told, hey, he heard about Jesus and then he did something about it. Well, of course, first he heard that Jesus was back in town. Jesus would move from place to place. Sometimes he's in the Decapolis, sometimes he's in Jerusalem. Now he's back in Capernaum. And so he heard he's back. But it's obvious, it's clear that the centurion had heard a lot more about Jesus just than he was back. We discover that the centurion had heard a lot of things, but He made his own decision about what he thought about Jesus, about what was true about Jesus. Because here's what we know. We know he had contact and relationship with the Jewish elders in this area. We will find out that he paid to build a synagogue for the Jews, and that's probably a good indicator that this centurion was what the Bible called a God-fearer. That was a title for a particular type of person during this period of time. A God-fearer meant a Gentile who believed in the Jewish God and embraced much of the Jewish religion, but they didn't become circumcised. They would attend synagogue with Jewish worshipers and worship with them, but they didn't follow all of the ceremonial purity laws. And so it was a class of people, God-fearers. Luke doesn't say it explicitly, but it's not a far jump for us to think that, okay, this guy's paying for a synagogue, he has belief, so he seems like he's a God-fearer. What would this centurion have heard about Jesus in the synagogue where his friends, the Jewish elders, were, and when he talked with them? Capernaum served as Jesus' headquarters at the time. He would have been very well known there, been talked about on every corner of every street. But even so, the news of Jesus' miracles had already spread far and wide by this time. But as the news spread, so did resistance, especially among the Jewish religious elite. By this time, Jesus had already been labeled a blasphemer by the scribes and the Pharisees. The Pharisees were already following Jesus and his disciples around. I guess they had nothing better to do. They would follow him around to complain when he would go to the house of a tax collector, or when he would spend time with people they didn't approve of, or they would complain that Jesus' followers didn't, fast the way that they did. And as recently as Luke chapter 6, just a few verses ago, we were told that the scribes and the Pharisees were filled with rage after Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath and were actively conspiring against him. They wanted to put a stop to this teacher from Galilee. So the centurion, undoubtedly, it's not a wild speculation to say he had heard a lot of things from a lot of people. But what's clear is that he considered these things, and he considered the truth on his own. He did not allow the local Jewish elders or the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem or Roman co-workers to determine what he thought about Jesus Christ. We'll find he had a remarkably robust understanding of who the Christ was. But in the moment, he might say, okay, come here, you guys, Jewish elders. He called them to his house or wherever. And he says, I know you don't like this guy. That's obvious. You tell me all the time. But I'm pretty sure he can save the life of my dying servant. And so I want you to go and do this for me. Don't let other people decide the truth for you. Don't do it. Jesus once said to those who believed in him, if you continue in my word, you really are my disciples. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. God gave you his word so that you could open it up, discover it, see what is revealed there, write it on your heart, and apply it to your life. You. Not someone else who does it for you, but you. We live in a time where it's commonplace to just let someone else tell you what to think, right? This is what the media wants to do. This is what celebrities want to do. This is what politicians want to do. We will tell you what to think, and now you fall in line with what we say is true, right? That's our culture, but don't fall into that. Don't let someone else tell you what is true, especially what is true about Jesus Christ. God has gone to considerable trouble to inspire, prepare, deliver, and preserve his word so that you and I each can come to it, read it, discover it, apply it to ourselves. And so remind yourself that God invites you individually to seek his wisdom, to seek his understanding, and he promises that if you do not have wisdom, it will not be withheld from you if you seek it. The centurion undoubtedly had heard a lot of things about Jesus. But what's clear is that he sifted through it all and decided on his own, I'm going to seek out the truth myself. Despite what this group is saying, I'm going to look at what has been revealed, and I'm going to choose to believe or not believe. In the second part of the verse, we're told he sent some Jewish elders to Jesus. Now, this is one of those funny, cringy moments because these guys did not like Jesus, not even a little bit. They did not believe in Jesus. They were probably part of a greater conspiracy to kill Jesus, but they felt indebted to the centurion, we'll see, and they either wouldn't or couldn't deny his request. And so they have to go and be an intermediary saying to Jesus, hey, this guy believes that you can help him, so will you come and do it? The message they were asked to deliver was, come and save the life of this servant. Actually, that's not the message they were given. We'll see that the centurion is sort of mortified when he finds out that Jesus is actually coming to his house. No, that's not what I said. I said, Jesus, will you help my dying servant? Will you save his life? Maybe Luke is giving us a little hint at sort of the frustration and how upset the Jewish elders were. They didn't get the message right. Maybe they were mad about it. The centurion never asked Jesus to come to his house. Verse 4, when they reached Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, he's worthy for you to grant this because he loves our nation and has built us a synagogue. So some linguists suggest that the Jewish elders were sharp and demanding of Jesus. That tracks. They say the elders didn't request it all, but they were summoning Jesus. You're coming. Let's go. That they kept on hastily beseeching him. In fact, the literal rendering of what they said to Jesus, I think this is interesting, was this: he for whom you will do this is deserving. Now, why? Why did they categorize this centurion as worthy? Well, they tell us right there. He's worthy because he did things for us, right? Isn't it telling? The Jewish elders, generally speaking, as we go through the Gospels, they hated that Jesus would do things like spend time with tax collectors, or when he would suggest that Gentiles were human beings worth saving. They did not like it. But of course, it's okay for them to like this Gentile because after all, he shelled out for their building. He did for us. He loves us, and so he's worth being loved in return. You know, it's human nature, very natural for us to show grace to some, but not to others, right? That's completely natural for every one of us. We'll overlook 1,000 flaws in a friend or someone that we think might get us something or benefit us in some way. But that other guy over there, that person over there, oh, I hate that guy. And I'll always hate that guy because look at all those flaws. Look at all those mistakes. Look at the things that they've said. Look at the kind of person they are. They are not worth kindness or grace or even the time of day. But the Sermon on the Mount comes along and says, oh no, that's not how you live anymore if you're a Christian. No, you don't live on the natural level anymore. You rise to the supernatural level where you are conformed to the image of Jesus. And what did Jesus do? Well, Jesus showed grace to Matthew the tax collector and Simon the zealot and Nicodemus the Pharisee and the woman caught in adultery and the rich young ruler and the Syrophoenician Gentile woman and the lepers and Jairus, the leader of the synagogue in Capernaum, whose daughter had not been yet raised from the dead. That's going to happen later in Luke. He may well have been part of this delegation and he hadn't yet had his encounter with Jesus Christ. But Jesus showed grace to all of them, mercy to all of them. Just like he shows mercy and grace to you and to me, and to the person sitting next to you, and the person sitting 3 rows behind you and in front of you, and those people who don't deserve the time of day as far as we're concerned. Listen, Jesus cares about you, not because of what you can do for him, not because you loved him first. You didn't love him first. He loved you first. In fact, before earth was created, before the foundation of the world, before time began, Jesus looked through human history, saw you, and loved you. Warts and all. Knowing every flaw, knowing every mistake, knowing every sin, knowing every way you would rebel against him, large and small, knowing that you at one point in your life, whether you were a little one or much older in life, that you would be at war with him. He said, but I love that person. I love them with everything I am. I love them so much, I'll die so that they can have a chance to have a relationship with me. Now, that's the kind of grace that God has for you and for the people of this earth. That doesn't mean that God is fine with us living whatever kind of life we want to live. That's very obvious. So sometimes people complain and they say, listen, you're suggesting that God's grace means it doesn't matter how I live, I'll just be forgiven of everything. Not at all. The Bible's so very clear on this. Paul says, should we sin that grace would abound? God forbid. Of course not. If you were a Christian, you wouldn't think that. God cares very much about how we live, the things that we do, the way that we behave. It's unacceptable to him that we rebel against him and his word and his commands. He still loves us. He still extends grace even to people like Saul of Tarsus who are murdering Christians. Do you realize that at the time that Saul was Saul, and he was doing his persecution on earth, that there was probably no one on planet earth who hated Jesus more than Saul of Tarsus. And yet the Lord personally reached out to him. He says, I love you. I want to save you from yourself, right? And so it's not that grace means God doesn't care what we do or that he just overlooks all of the mistakes that we made or all the sins that we commit. Not at all. Because all the people that Jesus interacted with, whether someone was a wealthy Pharisee, a penniless sinner, young, old, man, woman, Jesus called all of them and all of us to repentance, to forsake our sin and to devote ourselves to God. But his grace is freely extended to all, even to a representative of the oppressive Roman government, a centurion. Verse 6, Jesus went with them, and when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to tell him, Lord, don't trouble yourself, since I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. Okay, have you ever prayed, God, you're doing too much for me. Take a break and don't worry about helping me out so much. I certainly haven't. Maybe you have a greater faith than I do, but I've never asked God to stop doing so much on my behalf. But in a sense, that's exactly what the centurion said. This time he sent friends out because, he's an attentive guy. He sent the Jewish elders out. Maybe he caught the vibe that they were upset and frustrated. And maybe he said to somebody, hey, follow up and make sure they say what I actually said. Oh, they didn't? Okay, send the friends out and tell them, hey, don't come to my house. I didn't ask you to come to my house. It must have been a very comical scene on some level. Again, we have to speculate a bit and fill in the gaps. But there are Jesus and the Jewish elders. They're not buddies, but they're walking together. I wonder if the Jewish elders were walking fast so they weren't being seen with Jesus, And then this other delegation comes up. We don't know if they were other Jews or Romans. And they say, hey, what are you doing? Well, we're bringing the teacher to the house. No, that's not the job. That's not what he said. Stop. And then they say, you guys stand over here. Hey, Jesus, you don't need to actually come to the house. It's too much hassle for you. This is an interesting scene. Now, we want to look at how the faith of the centurion was doing things in his life, the fruit it was bearing, the kind of person it transformed him into. And so what do we see here? What did the centurion do? First, he didn't send a message berating the Jews that he sent. Using a term that I absolutely hate, he didn't throw them under the bus, right? He didn't say, these guys don't know what they're doing. They messed up, absolutely. They did not get the message right. They failed in the mission, right? But he wasn't mad about it. He didn't try to distance himself from them or call them out. He was gracious to them, even though they made a mistake that was kind of embarrassing him as a centurion. It's kind of embarrassing. He says, no, I don't want you to come to my house. I'm not worthy for you to come to my house. This is an embarrassing moment on some level for him, but he's still gracious to the Jewish elders. Second, more importantly, we see that he acknowledged that Jesus is Lord. Now, maybe he was just being respectful, but what he said next indicates that he actually had a faith that Jesus was the Christ, the Messiah, the Lord. His belief in Jesus not only gave him hope that his servant might not die, miraculous as that would be, but it shaped the way he thought of himself too. From the human perspective, this is a great warrior, a great leader, wealthy and successful, respected by friends, feared by enemies. Even the rulers of the Jews who don't usually like any Gentile, they called the Gentiles dogs, but they looked at him and they said, oh, this guy? Well, he's not a dog like the other Gentiles. He's worthy. But the centurion didn't believe his own press. He didn't believe his own resume. He had heard about Jesus Christ. Maybe he had heard Jesus Christ preach. We don't know. But he had heard enough about Jesus Christ to realize, oh, this is the Messiah. And the more he understood about Jesus Christ, the more he was able to evaluate himself. And as he evaluated himself, he said, oh, I'm not worthy at all. I'm not anything at all. Who am I that the Lord, the Christ, would come to my house? I have no place to demand anything from God. I'm not summoning him to my house. I'm going to come. I'm not even going to come myself. I'm not even worthy to be in his presence. I will send some friends to beseech him and say, would you please do this? Not even for me, but for my servant. Would you save this young boy? I'm unworthy to be in your presence. I'm unworthy for you to come to my home. As I've indicated a little bit already, faith in a heart grows fruit in a life. And every single person here, every single person on earth worships something, in the sense that every single one of us puts our hope for the future in something. It hangs the weight of our life on something. And that's faith, right? Whether it's we believe in the economy, or we believe in this political leader, or we believe in this man-made religion, or we believe in the God of the Bible, we're hanging the weight of our life, the hope for our future, on that thing. We're worshiping it. And like a tree, our faith grows and produces fruit in our lives. And we see the fruit in the centurion. In the centurion's heart, we see what? Fruit of humility, kindness, meekness, a willingness to trouble himself on behalf of a servant for whom he does not need to trouble himself. Servants were property back then. He could have discarded this young boy and been like, I'll get another one. It's just a DeWalt drill after all, right? But he didn't. His heart was transformed. He was a person who had true affection, true care for those around him, graciousness and kindness, long-suffering with the people around him. He was the total opposite of Naaman. Do you remember Naaman? I love the story of Naaman. It's back in the Old Testament. He was another Gentile military commander in desperate need of healing. When the man of God, Elisha, didn't come out to meet Naaman when he came, Naaman pitched a fit and he said, do you know who I am? Don't you love those like cell phone camera things of like celebrities who like flip out? Do you know who I am? Everybody's going to see who you are right now, right? So Naaman pitches this big fit and almost misses out on his healing. But here the centurion does not say, do you know who I am? It's amazing. He says, I know who I am. And I am not fit to be in the presence of the Christ for 1 minute, not even a little bit. I don't deserve it. I'm not clean enough. I'm inadequate. That's what he's saying. And you know what? It's not just low self-esteem. On a spiritual level, he was absolutely right. C.S. Lewis once wrote this to a friend. He said, the one essential symptom of the regenerate life is a permanently horrified perception of one's natural and it seems unalterable corruption. The true Christian's nostril is to be continually attentive to our inner cesspool. Vivid language, but it makes the point. And C.S. Lewis is absolutely right. The centurion agrees with him. Absolutely right. The centurion's message continued. This is why I didn't even consider myself worthy to come to you, but say the word and my servant will be healed. So the centurion, his faith was his own, despite what he might have heard from people who hated Jesus. It wasn't determined by what other people said. His faith had shaped his heart and his attitude toward himself and others. He had a remarkably spiritual perspective on his relationships to those out around him and to himself. And here we see a little glimpse of just how big his faith was. The centurion believed that Jesus speaks and the cosmos obeys. That's amazing. They didn't understand germs. They had, probably didn't understand much about disease or what was going on, but he did understand one thing. The Messiah speaks and the cosmos obeys. And it doesn't matter where the Messiah is, no matter where he is, no matter what's going on, he speaks and it is done. And he believed that even though he was unworthy, that God's desire was to help, to save, to show grace, to show kindness. Do we believe these things? I mean, we say, if you're a Christian, we say we do. Intellectually, yes, we believe these things, but man, looking at this centurion's faith is so inspiring, but also it's a moment of confrontation for us. Do I believe like this? Do I believe that God's intent in my life is really to do great and gracious things in and through me? Do I really believe that Jesus speaks and the cosmos obeys? Do I really believe in faith that Jesus' love and righteousness and grace and power are the answer to the problems in this world, the problems in my life? I'm sure the centurion sent for doctors. I'm sure they tried whatever medical, resources they had. But you understand, he had all kinds of money, all kinds of influence, all kinds of ability to command, and he cut through all that and he said, you know what I need? I need the Messiah to intervene. And I'm going to call out to him in faith. Verse 8, he continues and he says, for I too am a man placed under authority, having soldiers under my command. I say to this one, go, and he goes. And to another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it. The centurion here acknowledges that Jesus commands everything. He's not summoning Jesus. And even though he had a lot of earthly authority, you understand he had power over these people. When a centurion said, come here, you came. He had power over life and death. But what do we see here? That he, the centurion, the representative, an elite leader at one level in the Roman Empire, he put himself under the authority of this Galilean teacher. He says, no, actually, you're the commander. You're in charge. You're the boss. What you say is what is done. And I'm kneeling before you, metaphorically, to say, I'm asking you for this, but I'm not commanding you. I'm not summoning you. I'm requesting of you, and what you say will be done. And if you don't say it, I submit to that because you're the commander. In his analogy, the centurion assumes that Jesus' commands are good and they are compassionate. Did you notice that? Say the word, give the command, and what is the result? When you do, compassion and mercy and goodness will be the result. He assumes it. There's no question of whether, if this Messiah gives the command, we all die, right? He's not wondering, are you a good God or a bad God, right? Are you a Zeus? Are you a Hades? Are you a Ra? Are we cool? Are we not cool? He says, no, when you give a command, I know who you are. And when you give a command, it is good and it is merciful and it is compassionate. The unbelieving world sneers at the commands of God in the Bible. The unbelieving world accuses our God and his word of arbitrariness, of repressiveness, that this God of the Bible is oppressing you, holding you down, keeping you back. And what we need to do is throw off the Bible's morality, the Bible's rules, the Bible's laws, and that way we will be set free to, progress as human society. Is that true? It's not true. This was the argument all the way back at the beginning when all of human society was two people. In Genesis 3, the Lord said, hey, listen, here's my plan. Abundant life for you, perfect relationship between us, fruitfulness, joy everlasting, no suffering, no toil in your labor. All I need you to do is obey me and go with me. Very simple. And then the serpent comes along and the devil says, has God really said? You know what God really wants to do is keep you back, hold you down, not let you reach your real potential. But when they threw off God's commands, assuming that they knew better, what was the result? Death, suffering, sorrow, sin, destruction, ruin, the breaking of relationships between God and man, between man and woman, the absolute ruin of creation. And so here we see that this perspective, the centurion said, man, when you, the Messiah, command, the result is goodness, compassion, mercy, relief. And we know that this is true because God is good, and therefore his commands are good because he's a God of love and compassion. And so we've seen his faith, and now the response. Jesus heard this in verse 9 and was amazed at him. And turning to the crowd following him, he said, I tell you, I've not found so great a faith even in Israel. It's only 2 times that we're told that Jesus was astounded like this. Your version may say he marveled. Just 2 times. One is here at the faith of the centurion, and the other is at the lack of faith in Nazareth. Astounded at how little faith the people of Nazareth, his hometown, had. Where he should have found faith, there was none. It wasn't there. Many people had a really hard time believing Jesus. The scribes and Pharisees struggled, of course. But of course, so did the disciples. They weren't bad people. They weren't stupid, but they struggled. Even John the Baptist, Jesus' own cousin, the forerunner of the Messiah sent by God, no man greater born of woman than John the Baptist, Jesus said. And in a few verses after this story, he would send his own delegation, not to say, we believe you're the Messiah, but to say, are you the Messiah? We're not sure anymore. And so people struggled to believe what they believed. The 12, they believed, not Judas, but the others, the 11, they believed. But then Peter would sometimes pull Jesus aside and say, not so, Lord, that's not going to happen. What you just said, that's not going to happen. And at the night before his crucifixion, hey, you're one of his disciples, right? No, I don't know him. I don't know anything about him. But Peter believed. John the Baptist believed, but they struggled at moments to believe what they believed, to exercise their faith. Here, this centurion, we see this shining moment. I'm sure he had moments of doubt. We all do. It's not that he was better. It's not that he was greater. It's not that he was special and we're not. But it's this great example of showing this pristine, beautiful, exercised, living faith. And it gives us an opportunity to confront ourselves and say, how is my faith? Looking at this situation, you have the centurion, you have the Jewish elders, you have the 12, you have the people following into Capernaum. Where do we fall on that spectrum? The centurion, like I said, he wasn't better than us. He didn't have special understanding. In fact, we have way more revelation and understanding than he did about who Jesus is, what Jesus said, what he's done, what he's still going to do. It's not a question of cleverness or specialness. It's a matter of willingness. And sometimes the human heart is so unwilling. But we are able to have the kind of faith the centurion has. Despite the cultural, relational, personal pressures, he decided in this moment to surrender to the truth that had been revealed to him and say, I'm going to live by faith. I'm going to do it. I believe, and now that belief is going to do things in my life. It's going to determine what I think, what I do, how I act. He allowed his living faith to shape his mind, his perspective, his activities. And because of that, and this is maybe my favorite part, because of that, Jesus had the opportunity to do something unique, to heal from a distance. Well, big deal. Of course, Jesus can heal from a distance. We know that. They didn't know that yet. And it was a big deal. Why? Because one of the most important things that Jesus did while he was on the earth in his incarnation during that 3.5-year period of ministry was to reveal, I am the Messiah you're waiting for. It's me, it's me, it's me, it's me. No questions about it. Remember, we've talked about this before, how he proved, I am greater than Solomon. Check. I am greater than Jonah, he says at one point. Check. I'm greater than Moses. Check. And here we get an opportunity for him to show he's greater than Elisha. He's checking all of these boxes so that all of the people of Israel, there will be no mistake, there will be no question that this is the Messiah, this is him. You're not waiting for anybody else. This is the guy. And he had this unique opportunity to check this unique box. Hey, I'm greater than Elisha, because the centurion had faith to allow God to do what he wanted to do. Now, the centurion didn't know what was going on with all this Elisha stuff and revealing the kingdom, all these things. He's like, hey, my servant needs to be healed. But because he was exercising faith and because he was submitted to God and because he believed in the Lord, God was able to providentially use his life to do this unique, special, history-changing thing, right? And so it's a beautiful image of how when we exercise faith, then God says, great, now let me do something even more than you could ever ask or imagine through your life and through your experience. Verse 10, when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the servant in good health. Luke leaves out a few last details. Matthew records that Jesus said, go as you have believed, let it be done for you. And the servant was healed that very moment. The centurion didn't have to buy his way into relationship with Jesus. He didn't have to prove he deserved it. In fact, he agreed that he didn't deserve it. And the Lord was so excited to minister to him and this dying boy. This kind of faith is not impossible for us. It is possible for any of us. That's the point of this example. Our lives are each an opportunity for God to do something unique for his glory, to reveal his love and his kindness to a needy world. If faith is alive and well in our hearts, we will be more like the centurion and less like everyone else in the scene. Living faith keeps a proper understanding of how poor in spirit we really are, but holds confidently to what we know is true about our Savior, his compassion, his power, his grace, his desire to work in and through our circumstances. It's not always easy. I know I find myself feeling like the disciples later in Luke 17, where he says, here's what it means to be a Christian. And their response is, Lord, increase our faith. We can't do that, right? That's how I feel most of the time. I can't live out the Christian life if this is what it is, but we can do it because God is with us. And he says, I accomplish this in my power through you if you surrender to me and exercise your faith. If you're willing to be strengthened and encouraged in your faith as you walk by faith and live in faith day by day. Let's pray.